Jon Cole is a civil engineer who is now focusing on the actual motion of the Twin Towers. He makes it so clear as to what's actually happening to the towers. Even a seventh grader can see through the official narrative with his help. Like most Americans, he believed the official version of what we were told for many years. Then in late 2007, he started to do some research on how the buildings fell and realized that something was very wrong with the official story. In 2010, he began conducting real world experiments, making videos to either prove or disprove what we were being told about the official story, focusing on the Twin Towers and Building 7. Jon was one of many experts who spoke at the 2011 Toronto hearings on the events of 9/11, and also one of the 23 members of the 9/11 Consensus Panel, co-founded by David Ray Griffin and Elizabeth Woodworth. His experimental work, as well as other videos, can be found on YouTube under the name Physics and Reason, altogether one word, YouTube channel, Physics and Reason. The website 911speakout.org also, and on the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth website, ae911truth.org. And now on the new website of Richard Gage, richardgage911.org. So his presentation is entitled 9/11 and the Scientific Method, Part 1, Motion. Who wants to talk about motion? You will when you see my incredible guest. Jon, welcome to richardgage911.org.
Hi, Jon. Welcome.
Hi, Gail. Hi, Richard. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate this.
Oh, you are so very welcome. We're honored to have you.
We are.
Now, Gail, you've got some work to do behind the scenes. Shall we let you do that, or do you want to stay tuned? And well, you will be able to watch Jon from behind the scenes.
Yes, I'll be able to watch. Yes.
All right. She's not going far, everybody.
No, and I'll be back.
Sometimes we have to let her go. It's a little painful.
Oh.
But here she goes. And yep, there she goes. Jon, you and I have got some work to do. Tell us what you're going to be talking about in a little more detail, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, sure, Richard. Yeah, as you well know, probably more than anybody, how big of a subject 9/11 is. It's a huge subject. I mean, as a founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, you focus on the three buildings destruction. And even looking at just the three buildings destruction, you can further break that down into what I did is I broke it down into two fundamental elements. The first, this is part one, I call just the motions that were observed. And then the second one, I have another webinar I can do later on, or I have done later on, is just on the temperatures, the extreme temperatures on there, because the subject is so big. And what I try to do is I try to simplify it down on both these webinars. So I'm just looking at just the motions that were observed on 9/11 with those twin towers. And again, I try to simplify it. As you said, a seventh grader can see it. Even a 2-year-old can see it, or about a 5-year-old.
I wasn't going to go that far, but
yeah, well, it's so obvious once you see it. But just like myself, I didn't see it for 6 years. And looking back, I don't know why I was so gullible, and I just didn't see it because I wasn't aware of it. But then once you see it, I saw it like in 10 minutes. Once I saw those things, and the key is to observe. As somebody said, observation is the starting point of science. Well, you need to observe and actually see what's happening. And then it's just going to click. It's going to hit you like a sledgehammer for a lot of people. Some people can't deal with it. But anyhow, so again, I'm going to look at the motion of the towers primarily from the beginning of the fall to the end of the fall. And that's pretty much it. And there's so much to talk about just looking at the motion that unfortunately it's going to take me about an hour and a half to go through this thing. And I want to tie it
and there's nothing unfortunate about that, Jon, because we don't want you to leave out any detail.
Okay. My angle on this is I try not to use any math, any difficult math, actually almost no math at all. No
2-year-old math.
2-year-old math, right. No science, really. You need to observe, and I compare it to what I call nature or experiment. And that's the angle I look at this thing, and just kind of a comparative analysis between what nature does versus what all the authorities and the experts on TV are telling us. They're two different things, and that's where I'm going with this.
Well, let's get started, John. Go for it, my friend. I'll be right here egging you on.
All right, very
And I
good.
might play a little bit of devil's advocate too.
Okay, I need that. That's good. Got to straighten me out. Yeah, so I'm getting older and blinder. I do need my glasses now. Let's see if this thing's going to work. So yeah, again, this is just this is my part 1 on motion. And guess what's not working already? There it goes.
There we go.
Okay, so before we talk about the tower's destruction, what I like to do is just to bring everybody up to speed. I like to assume, first of all, that not everybody is as familiar with 9/11 and the topic here. Certainly as you are, Richard, but even for most people, I like to start kind of at the beginning. And to talk about the destruction, we first have to understand a few things about the tower. So the tower was basically consisted of an internal rectangular core. The core columns, there were 47 core columns. How many there were is not that critical. And it was a rectangle. That internal core was about 88 feet by 138 feet. And this is the core right here where I'm moving my cursor. These are these cranes sitting on the top of the core columns during the construction. On the outside of the tower were these perimeter columns, and the outside was basically a square. It was 207 by 207, and there were these 14-inch steel columns that were pre-welded and then brought up and then bolted together. You can see the holes right here. These are the bolt holes right here where they were bolted together, but this whole segment was brought up, and you're going to see a little video on that shortly here. In between the inner columns and the outer columns was what we call an open web bar joist. This was an open web steel frame joist that ran from the inner columns to the outer columns, and the longest span was around 60 feet long. And then on top of that was what we call a pan deck. It's a metal, basically it's a metal galvanized deck. And then on top of that, they would pour some lightweight concrete. In cross section, it was just basically a big rectangle going all the way up. And there were 99 elevators, and there was what's called sky lobbies. Not all the elevators went to the top. There were different elevator shafts stopping at the sky lobbies for efficiency. Okay. Here's a little video of construction just showing those members being hoisted up. And they were just set in place. And then there was either 6 bolts or 4 bolts holding those together. There's the center core columns of the cranes. And then between the inner and outer core columns, you can see the pan trusses, which represent the floors. And this is just kind of an interesting video on how they built the thing. And there's the iron workers. At the top of these, they turned into wide flange instead of box columns in the core. So this is near the top, showing these are standard. Some people call them I-beams or wide flange beams. Okay, on the top of both towers was what's called a hat truss. And on the top of Tower 1, we're going to mostly be looking at Tower 1. There was this tall antenna. It was about 350 to 360 feet tall. It's a big television antenna. And on top of the inner core columns was this thing called a hat truss, which was basically just a bunch of cross members that tied all the inner core columns together, but it also held the upper antenna, and it also, again, there was these outriggers that went to the outer perimeter box columns. So you're going to hear me talk about the hat truss in here, and this is the thing I'm talking about. That hat truss it was a deep truss system. It went all the way up from the 107th to the 110th floor. And by the way, there's 110 floors on this thing. It was about 55 feet high or deep here, and it was kind of angled up here. And you can see where the antenna is, how it kind of angles up and then back down again. But this thing kind of held everything together, and it was a big truss system. Well, now let's talk about the tower's destruction. And surprisingly, there's been many theories over the years. The first theory, which was actually the most dominant theory that day, I watched these things come down. I was at work, same place I'm working now. We watched it in the conference room here. And the day it happened, all of the news media besides talking about the plane impact, they were talking about explosions. They were talking about secondary devices that were planted in the building, which kind of made sense because, you know, when Wachos come down, it's like, oh yeah, I guess that could be exploding coming down there. And we knew in 93 that there was a van parked down in the basement, same thing. And it was a terrorist attack with explosions. So this is just an example, a little compilation of everything that we heard the very first day.
Actually, devices that were planted in the building. There was another explosion that took
explosion.
second explosion.
Had that big explosion. Heavy duty explosion.
Some of the people out, and there's some secondary explosions.
When the explosion blew and it knocked everybody over. Huge explosion that we all heard. Big explosion. An explosion. Explosion.
And another explosion.
Explosion. A lot. We heard a big explosion.
Big explosion. Explosions.
Of the explosion. Just explosion.
So, and this one right, this gentleman right here, he was actually in the tower. He got out, fortunately, but I mean, they were in there. They heard explosions. Then the next day, okay, this is September 12th. We didn't hear anything more about explosions. It was kind of odd. It's like that's all we heard the first day, but the second day, no, dude, we didn't hear about explosions. Matter of fact, if you looked in your America's Newsweek, America Under Attack, and you looked in all your local papers that just kind of parroted what the AP was saying, they started talking about melted steel. And here's a whole series of quotes from, and these are from experts. These are not just, this is not just your average guy saying this. This is from universities. And they were in our mainstream media. The intense fire has caused the towers to collapse. It melted the structural steel. What the firemen might not have realized is that the gushing jet fuel was melting the steel. In just under an hour, a raging fire from burning aviation gasoline softened or perhaps melted the steel. Stanford University professors, the intense heat could have melted the building's core, allowing for the collapses, he suggested. Structural engineer from the University of Arizona, flames fueled by thousands of gallons of aviation fuel melted the building steel supports. Professor of structural engineering at University of Newcastle, 35 tons of aviation fuel will have melted the steel. MIT professors come out. I believe the intense heat softened or melted the structural elements. So this isn't just anybody on the street saying there was melted steel, or saying that the steel's melted and that's why the towers came out. These are professionals, engineers, and scientists that are coming out and telling us that the steel melted. Also on September 12th, and almost the same article, they told us that the floors progressively collapsed. Okay, and this is what's called, this was an illustration on September 12th of the New York Times, and it talks about the failure of the column systems. The building of floors appeared to fall nearly straight down in a floor-by-floor collapse. So this is what was called the pancake theory. In this theory, along with the melted steel theory, or maybe in concert with it, that carried for a long time. Also, on September 13th, there was another theory that came out, and it was what's called a rapid communication. And it was by a professor of, I believe, Northwestern University, Professor Bazant, and others, but he was kind of the main one that pushes this theory forward, and it still continues today. He put forward a theory called the crush down, crush up theory of collapse, or it's also called the pile driver theory of collapse. Now, this theory does not say that it was a floor-by-floor pancake theory. What this theory basically says is that there was where the planes hit in this upper area, there was this upper block of floors, and once it heated up there and the collapse began, this smaller upper block started driving down this larger block down to the ground. Now, this theory, for me personally, is pretty difficult to believe on a number of fronts, and I'm going to show you why. So I'm going to give this one kind of special attention as we go through here. But basically, within the first week of September 11th, we had 4 different explanations. Day 1, we had the explosive demolition with devices that were planted in a building. We had the melted steel theory. We had the floor-by-floor progressive collapse, or the pancake theory. And then we had the pile driver, at least the beginning of it, the crush down, crush up theory. Now, over time, there were other theories that were proposed over the years. One of them was by another professor, Dr. Judy Woods. She wrote a book called Where Did the Towers Go? And she just looked at still pictures. She didn't look at them in motion. She concluded that it was her opinion that the steel was, the word she used was dustified. And that some sort of directed energy weapons from outside the structures must have vaporized basically the building. She also doesn't think, she's on video, she doesn't even think that planes actually hit the towers. I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit in part of the motion here. Now, it turns out that actually Richard Gage and myself, and I think Roberts, I think, the three of us, we wrote an FAQ, a frequently asked questions, called FAQ 13, and that's on ae911truth.org. There's a lot of information on that if you want to get into that, why that theory is very problematic. Another theory that came out was the thermonuclear or mini nuke theory, where that theory is assuming that some sort of micro nukes or mini nukes were placed either inside the towers or down in the basements. Also, there's a frequently asked question. I'm going to touch on that going through here as it relates to the motion. That's also an FAQ that's on the AE911 site. Then later on, there was another theory that came out, and this was on mainstream media. This was pushed by the mainstream in addition to the pancake and pile driver. This was called the aluminum sprinkler theory. And this was put out by somebody by the name of Christian Simonson, as well as Frank Greening. Frank Greening has been involved a lot in this thing. He was one behind this theory. See if I can get this thing to play. Oh, I know the problem.
Frank Greening and Christian Simonson believe they have found the answer to some of the questions left unexplained by the official report. The theory goes like this. Inside the burning floors, the building debris collects to form an insulating wall around the aircraft wreckage, creating a furnace. Inside, the aluminum reaches 1,000 degrees. At 700 degrees above its melting point, the aluminum now flows like water. Finding cracks and holes in the damaged floor, the molten metal lands in pools of water from the sprinkler system on the floor below. The theory could explain several of the questions unanswered by the official report, including the explosions heard by 118 firemen.
Those were all sort of the unofficial theories. A lot of those came out in the media. I mean, we listen to the media, that's who told us. But what about the official government theory? That you would think that that would be the one that counts the most. Well, there were several reports that were put together. The first report, most of you are familiar with it, it's called the FEMA report. FEMA and ASCE, they went out on the site and they published a report in May of 2002. And they collected a bunch of data. And some of the report editors were the same ones that are going to be in the what's called the NIST report. So this is kind of the same people working back and forth. And unfortunately, they said with the information and time available, the sequence of events leading to the collapse of each tower could not be definitively determined. So they didn't even know how the sequence of events led to the collapse, let alone the collapse itself. So that report didn't really give us much information as far as, hey, how did those towers come down? It did endorse the truss failure pancake theory, where the trusses break away and then they start moving down. But it didn't really give us anything about the actual collapse itself. There was also the 9/11 official commission report that was studied for several years. It was a bipartisan commission report that was published in July 2004. There's really nothing of anything of value as far as the science of how those buildings came down. I don't even think they mentioned Building 7 at all. So that report was pretty useless. Then Congress, they were getting an awful lot of heat from a lot of people and say, hey, it'd be kind of nice to know, how did those towers come down? Because we have all these mixed stories going back and forth. So Congress tasked the NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology, you'll hear them an awful lot. They tasked them to determine why and how World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed following the initial impacts of the aircraft. Now, NIST studied this thing for almost 3 years. And they put together a huge report, multiple facets of it, and I think it's around 10,000 pages and 16 or $20 million worth of study on this thing. And when all was said and done, they said they were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. What they did is they brought their study up to what we call collapse initiation. In other words, a sequence of events leading up to the collapse, and then they stopped. Then they just concluded that global collapse ensued. In other words, unlike the media and the professors, they couldn't explain the collapse process for the largest structural failures of mass murder in American history, and they just simply concluded that collapse was inevitable. They did have a probable collapse sequence. I'm just going to go through this quickly because it's going to tie to some of the stuff I'm going to get to later. They basically said that the floors weakened with the increasing temperatures. They started sagging, and they started having inward pulling on the south wall columns. The south wall columns bowed inward, and the bowing induced column instability, which progressed rapidly across the entire south face. The perimeter column loads redistributed via the hat truss to the core columns. Remember that hat truss? That's on top of the core column. So they're saying it went from the perimeter columns to the hat truss through those little outriggers there, and then global collapse then ensued. So remember this, the failure sequence, according to NIST, is a perimeter columns buckled first to the hat truss, and then the core columns failed second. But again, that's where they stopped, and that's where I want to begin. Again, NIST said they were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. So again, isn't this odd? This is the largest structural failure in history, with the killing of 2,700 people roughly in those towers. And the official government report could not provide a full explanation of the collapse. That should be your first telltale sign that there's something wrong here. If they couldn't do it.
And this didn't come till years later, John, in response to a FOIA request that I and several others submitted in 2006, I believe it was. They said, sorry, because we asked them, how did the thing collapse? And they said, well, we unable to provide a full explanation.
Yeah. It's incredible. It's incredible, Richard. So again, anybody looking at this thing, I don't care how gullible they are and how much they believe in our system. That alone, or any engineer out there, or anybody should say, well, that's weird. Why can't they provide a full explanation? They spent years on this thing and they couldn't do it. So even though NIST couldn't, and they didn't, once again, the academic professors, private individuals, and the corporate media did. So they took over. NIST couldn't come up with a good solution, so the corporate media did, because the corporate media is not bound by any type of, they are not required by law to tell the truth. They can say pretty much whatever they want, and they can just rely on other sources. So the average person learned about the total collapse story, the entire collapse, through the mainstream media and not any official government investigation. Remember Dr. Greening about the aluminum sprinkler theory? Well, he also did what's called a momentum transfer with his home computer. So all the NIST engineers couldn't do this, but the Smithsonian Channel and Dr. Greening solved it. And again, this was pumped out to us, the audience, like, okay, I guess he figured it out.
So why did the Twin Towers fail so disastrously and so quickly? The official government report into the Twin Towers tragedy only tackled events on the initial impact floors, not the physics behind the subsequent collapse. Nuclear chemist Dr. Frank Greening was also surprised that the towers collapsed so quickly.
I ran the program. It showed that the buildings would indeed come down. Even more interesting was the computer program predicted the collapse times.
I want you to remember what he just said. First of all, they're trying to show what the official government story couldn't show because they never told us. So they're jumping in and finishing the story. And B, he said his program predicted the collapse time. We're going to talk a lot about the collapse time because everybody looks at the beginning of the collapse and makes some assumptions. Also, PBS Nova. We all know who PBS is, Public Broadcasting, Nova, very scientific channel. They put together also a explanation of the total collapse. And again, they use the pancake theory, and you're going to notice that they don't use the actual collapse itself. the graphics from it. They like to use animations, and this is what they told all their millions of viewers watching this.
The heat of the fire would have softened both the floor trusses and the outer columns they were attached to. When the steel became weak, the trusses would have collapsed. And without the trusses to keep them rigidly in place, the columns would have bent outward and then failed. Once the trusses fail, the floors they were holding cascade down with a force too great to be withstood. The result is what's called a progressive collapse, as each floor pancakes down onto the one below.
A couple of things to notice. Number one, when they showed those trusses breaking away, there was no floor system on it. They just showed independent trusses. Number two, in this animation right here, what do we see standing there? They don't exactly explain how those core columns came down. Number three, on this animation here, they don't show any perimeter columns. And number four, they show this coming straight down and not kind of blowing outward like we're going to see later. Also, what they're telling us, their theory is completely opposite of the official investigation. They said the truss connections broke and the perimeter columns bowed outward. The NIST sequence of probable sequence of collapse, they said the truss connections held and it pulled the columns inward. So what we're being told by the official science channels is directly in opposition to what the official investigation told us. So NIST, again, they could not solve how it totally collapsed. And again, they disagreed. They disagreed with FEMA, the ASCE, PBS NOVA, and many others who saying it wasn't a pancake progressive collapse. They said the NIST findings do not support the pancake theory of collapse. And they're saying at the bottom there, they're saying, thus the floors did not fail progressively, causing a pancake phenomenon. So they're saying, no, it was not a pancake theory of collapse, even though we were told that for about 3 or 4 years ahead of that. So again, we have completely opposing theories. So over time, we have at least 7 theories of how the towers came down. We have the devices planted in the buildings on day one, the explosive demolition theory. We have the melted steel theory. We have the pancake theory, the floor-by-floor pancake theory. We have the pile driver, crush down, crush up theory. We have the directed energy weapon theory, or the dustification of steel theory from outside weapons coming at it, and these are unofficial. We have the mini nuclear bomb theory, and then we have that from the scientific channels. We have the aluminum sprinkler explosion theory, where pieces of the airplane went down and started blowing things up automatically coming down. And as far as the official reason for the collapse, well, there's no theory at all. We have no theory because they stopped before all the action started happening. So which hypothesis out of those 7 is correct? Okay, well, we need to apply what's called the scientific method whenever we have opposing hypothesis. Well, what's the scientific method? Okay, the scientific method, you've all learned this probably in grade school, but basically you ask a question. Okay, in this case here, hey, how did those towers collapse? Well, I don't know how they collapsed. Then you do some background research. You start collecting everything you know about the time frame that you're looking at. You don't worry about things that are not in your time frame. You don't worry about the Pentagon. You don't worry about anything else. You study the time frame you're looking at, and you gather all available information that has to do with the question that you're being asked. Then you build your hypothesis, and we just looked at there's 7 different hypotheses that have been proposed. And then this is the key: you test your hypothesis by doing any experiment you can. Okay, and you compare the hypothesis with the experiment. Does it make sense? Does it follow nature's law? You analyze your data, and then you draw a conclusion. Now, experiments, this is just a direct quote from Wikipedia. Everybody thinks, oh my God, experiments, we have to have a guy in a trench coat and a lab coat, or it's got to be on some remote mountaintop. Well, it doesn't have to be. Experiments, you are living an experiment. We live in nature right now. Every action you take is what nature is doing to your body as you move around. So you can do experiments anywhere from a garage. In my case, I did it behind a barn. And you can learn a lot from those experiments. So you don't have to be on a scientific channel. You can do your own experiments. We live in nature. We live in experiments. Now, Richard Feynman, he was a theoretical physicist. in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. He got the Nobel Prize in theoretical physics. He knew how important experiment was because he saw how much nonsense comes out with all these technical papers or something from the official authorities, how they come out. And he knew how critically important it was, no matter who you are, to do an experiment. This is Richard Feynman in front of a class, driving home the point of how critical experiment is.
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are, who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, wrong. That's all there is to it.
So what he's saying there is it doesn't matter. I don't care how many initials you have after your name. I don't care if you're with NIST or the government or a professor. If your theory disagrees with experiment, your theory is wrong. Okay, so let's get into some observations and measurements of motions. Well, the first significant motion on 9/11 was actually when the plane hit. Okay, there was some motion on that tower when the plane hit. Now, I'd mentioned before that Dr. Woods didn't believe a plane hit, and there's people out there who think that no plane hit the tower because they think that, well, aluminum can't go through steel, and they claim that it's all CGI or faked. Well, there's a lot of problems with the no plane theory. First of all, the center of mass for the planes did the most damage, not the wingtips. The wingtips didn't hardly did any damage at all. The jet engines are made of titanium, not aluminum, so it's not that soft. It's a harder material. Titanium was invented in the late 1700s. A little side note: titanium is named after the Titans of the Greek. From the Greeks, the Titan gods of Titan. The other thing is the wall segments were actually bolted together. We saw in that video with them being hoisted up and bolted together. In a lot of cases, those bolts actually failed in shear. Not all of them, but most of them. And again, the wingtips didn't actually cut the steel columns. It did damage the aluminum cladding quite a bit. And we can see the plane shadow just before it hit. So just before that plane hit, we saw a shadow. Now, most importantly, where it ties to motion is the tower moved or it swayed about 20 to 22 inches. We can measure that as soon as it was impacted. So that whole tower was shifting and moving on impact. So if you don't think a plane hit the tower, well, something moved that tower when it got hit. We can see that, I believe, on Tower 2. And there's been quite a bit of study on that. So something moved that tower exactly on impact, and something created a shadow on impact. So the no plane theory, just as it ties to motion, has got some serious problems that needs some explaining. And finally, the whole idea that a softer material, aluminum, can't go through steel. I hear that all the time. Oh, aluminum can't go through steel. That's impossible. So therefore, no plane hit. Well, how about lead or copper? Can that go through steel? Okay. Well, I did a little experiment. I do experiments all the time. I'm a rifle shooter. I shoot guns. I have my own range. Well, here's a plate. Here's a plate of steel. This is 1/4-inch steel. And here's a lot of holes through that steel. What are the bullets made out of? They're made out of copper and lead. So it depends on the velocity and energy. I don't want to get all sciencey here, but it goes up with a square velocity, the energy on it. So a soft material can indeed go through steel. And again, that's just the result of an experiment. And you can do it yourself. Grab a 30-06 and blast a steel plate. It'll punch a hole in it. Okay, as far as the collapse itself, the first motion that was observed for the collapse itself of World Trade Center 1. Now, remember that motion I talked about, the swaying, that happened about an hour or so, hour and a half beforehand. Now we're going to look at just the collapse time frame from when the thing started to go down. And it turns out that, remember that antenna that was on top of the tower? Well, it's got some bands there. There's like a dark band there. You can see the antenna over on the right-hand side there. And FEMA actually noticed in their report, there is some data in the FEMA report that's worth taking a look at. They gathered a lot. They said that review of the videotape recordings of the collapse taken from the various angles indicates that the transmission tower on the top of the structure began to move downward and laterally slightly before the movement was evident on the exterior wall. Okay, they say this suggests that collapse began with one or more failures of
Uh-oh. We froze John. Well, we didn't freeze him. Going to bring Gail back into the stream and make sure we're all on the same page. Gail, can you hear John?
No, I don't hear him. I can see him talking, but
He might
wait,
have had another power failure.
yeah, he's not talking, so he definitely froze. Wow, dang.
He knows how to get back in though, so that's the good news.
Yeah, so give him a minute. Who knows what's going on his end as far as weather or anything like that. A lot of things can affect it.
Do you have any
Yes.
comments that you'd like to share from the yeah, he's gone for good now. Not for good.
Don't say for good.
From the YouTube comments?
Yes, let's take a look and see. We want to save the questions for him. So here's a sweet one from Gene. He says, "Oh man, this is going to be so good, and I have to hard stop at 5 p.m." He did say goodbye, like later on. He's on YouTube,
Oh,
and he
that's right
said he
now.
had to go.
Yeah, if you
So
guys, well, we don't want to lose our listeners, but every Sunday, Gene has the 9/11 War Room, and that's at 2 p.m. Pacific right now. So he'll be able to watch and you all can also certainly on our YouTube channel, Richard Gage 911 WTC, and on our website, richardgage911.org.
yes, here's another comment from Ken Davies.
Go ahead and read it.
Davies. Kind of not at all surprising how important 9/11 remains in the light of COVID and what we are learning now. I guess I should speak in code, that disease nobody wants.
Yeah, it's in other words, 9/11 is a key domino that knocks down the others. Some people can see COVID and the false flag operation that it is and has gotten worse, of course, with you know what. But others, yeah, we're on YouTube, so we can't speak our minds. We've lost how many channels? 3, 4 channels.
Too many. I mean,
Lots
for
and
the
lots of
most,
strikes.
yeah, and for the most ridiculous reasons too, like saying hate speech. It's like, saying facts about buildings falling. There he is. John, you're back.
My computer likes to die for some reason. Maybe it's on its last legs or can't handle this. I don't know. I
Oh
apologize.
no.
Well,
Sorry,
this
everybody.
this is getting so good. So don't stop now, John.
Okay.
Yes, don't stop now.
We're all together going to be able to handle this. And certainly we'll edit out these sections that are lengthy so people can share this information
Yes.
Oh, that'll be
without
great.
interruptions.
Yes. The magic of editing.
Gail, do you want to share another comment?
This was from Gene before he left, and it's actually YouTube. He says, "Love to hear John expound on the very existence of the freestanding core columns, also known as the spire, destroys not only the Besant crush down, crush up theory, but all gravity collapse theories."
Yeah,
So, and he
it's
had to
incredible.
leave, so he's not here to hear that. But
Yeah, that'll be forthcoming, right, John?
That's correct. I think I'm loaded.
awesome.
You got it?
Hey,
Okay.
look at that.
You
Right
can
where you
send me
were, too.
away.
You're getting
Richard.
good at this.
Well, yeah.
All right, we'll send Gail away.
It must have
Everybody
a lot
say
of time.
goodbye to Gail.
It's all part of the experiment. When you screw up in life, you get better at it. So again,
Yeah.
so the
Gail, you could remove that comment. That would be great.
okay. So
All right, John, it's all yours.
okay. So again, so the first motion to happen was the antenna falling, and this is exactly so that implies that the core columns had to fall first. Okay, so because that antenna was on the truss, was on that hat truss, those core columns must have been cut first, which is opposite of what the NIST sequence of events was. They said that it was the perimeter columns that moved first and not the core columns. So there's something wrong right off the bat here. The other problem with the antenna moving first, at least with the directed energy folks, is if those internal core columns were cut first to make that antenna drop, how did any directed energy weapons from outside the building get through the perimeter columns to attack the core columns? Well, it couldn't have. So that's just problem number one
One of how many, John?
of many.
That's for sure.
The other issue, the other motion that we saw at first was that the first volume to be destroyed was in that upper smaller portion of the building. Okay, we can see that. The crush down, crush up pile driver theory says that that remained intact and drove everything down to the bottom.
Yep.
And so that's a problem with the crush down, crush up theory. And here's just another animation going through here showing how that upper block was being destroyed before there was much destruction down below.
It's very clear.
Now, the other thing, I think we can all agree that there was a lot of motion going on when he started coming down, but I think we can all agree that there was two basic motions. There was a downward motion, we see that, right? But there was also an outward motion. So, and again, there's a lot of other complex motions going on there, but in general, if you had to say there was two motions going on, I think we could say that there was an outward motion and a downward motion as a general rule, and I don't think anybody would disagree. So we just talked about there was two motions basically, right? There's a downward motion and an outward motion.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do is just kind of build a case here. We're just trying to do our first data collection. We're trying to gather data and we're trying to measure things, okay? And the other thing that we notice is that there was a sudden and smooth downward acceleration of the top, okay? And it was found to uniformly accelerate smoothly down, and it didn't quite go down at free fall. It went down at 6.3 meters per second. Doesn't matter. Let's say 60 or 80% of free fall. It doesn't matter. 63%, something like that. So, but the point is, the key point is that it went down smoothly. It did not go down with any kind of jolts or impacts. And this just shows it smoothly going up and down. Again, with no impacts or jolts. So this is all part of motion. Now, some people say, well, maybe the reason you didn't see the motion is because of the frame rate was too slow or something. I mean, maybe the reason you didn't see any impacts was because of the frame rate. But the problem is we have a lot of other measurements that we've done with other building collapses. And one of them is called vernage. It was done by the French do it. They weaken a central middle portion of a building intentionally, and then they hit the key columns, and then it does come down by gravity, and it's been measured, and probably the same video frame rates. David Chandler put a little video together showing that indeed there should have been some impact as these buildings come down if it was a gravity-driven collapse.
The Balzac Vitry demolition is particularly interesting for our purpose. The question we want to answer here is whether the predicted deceleration of the falling section will show up in our measurements. The downward acceleration is less than the acceleration of gravity. As the contact begins, the slope becomes less steep. However, when the two sections of the building fully engage, the slope of the graph turns around and actually rises, indicating the downward velocity is decreasing. This is clear deceleration, just as we predicted.
So one way to tell the difference between a gravity collapse and some other kind of collapse is if there's impacts, measurable impacts or jolts. The other thing we notice is that the destruction of the corners of the towers lagged behind the destruction of the floors. The floors raced ahead of the corners, so the corners were secondary. So that kind of blows apart the floor by floor collapse because it doesn't explain how the corners would be standing or lagging behind the main portions of the floors. And this is just a video. Also, we notice that with that outward motions, the force driving that stuff out, driving that material out, had to come from inside the building. Would you agree with that? Like when you throw a baseball, the force comes behind it. So the force was from inside the building. So again, it couldn't be directed energy weapons from outside the building blowing that out because they couldn't have gotten inside to blow that material out. And it probably wasn't nuclear bombs, because why didn't the nuclear bombs blow out the corners along with the floors?
Hmm.
So that kind of that's evidence. That's direct visual evidence as far as kind of making it a problem as far as the nuclear bomb concept and the directed energy from outside the building. Okay, and again, the destruction was not uniform across the whole width. Okay, and I think Richard Gage shows this really well in a lot of his presentations, where he shows that it wasn't uniform or linear all across it. He shows the collapse waves racing ahead on one side rather than the other side, or on one side well ahead of the other side, and again ahead of the corners. The problem is the crush down, crush up theory. It says right in his theory that the crush front formed across the whole width of the tower and continued all the way down. Well, we can see from direct observation that this is not true. It does not. This basic assumption does not match observation. Also, with the racing ahead, with one area racing ahead of the other, micro nukes in the basement, I'm not sure how it produces sequencing from the top down. It's not clearly explained to me.
Yeah, the leading corner on the lower right is 20 stories ahead of what we're told is a gravitational collapse. So if it's mini nukes, they're going off in the corner more like locally and paired miniature explosions,
Right.
floor by floor.
Right. So again, the floor by floor theory, the pancake theory, and the crush down, crush up pile driver theory does not match observation. Observation is what it's all about. We all have eyes. We can see what's happening. Okay. And this is, again, just some more non-uniform explosions coming out ahead. And Richard shows us in a lot of his videos.
I think that's my favorite video of all, John. I mean, what are we
Yeah.
looking at there? I mean, we have to use our own judgment.
Yeah. Now that we've kind of set the stage, we've done some observation, we have some measurements about the no impacts coming down. Let's do some experiments, and let's see if we can compare the theories with what nature is telling us. All right. Well, first of all, some people, well, they'll come out and they will say that, hey, you can't model the towers. You can't build a scale model of the towers. And I'm never trying to do that. I never say I'm trying to build a model of the towers, but there are many properties out there that are independent of scale. For example, Newton's third law, opposite and equal forces are always equal and opposite. The direction of acceleration is always in line with the direction of the net force. Again, throw a baseball or a rock, the force had to come in the same direction. Regardless of its size, shape, or mass, we know that the direction had to be in line with the direction of force. The sequence of forces is independent of scale. If I pull a trigger, the bullet comes out of the gun. The bullet doesn't come out of the gun, and then I pull the trigger. So the sequence has to be the trigger first, and then the bullet comes out of the gun. The trajectory path or falling objects is the same. Whether I throw a baseball or I throw a kitchen sink, the trajectory is a parabola, and it's the same. The acceleration of falling objects is independent of mass. Galileo did his famous, we're told, on the Leaning Tower of Pisa, two different sized masses. They accelerate and they hit the ground at the same time. The period of a pendulum is independent of mass. Melting points of materials is independent of the material size, and chemical reactions are independent. So there's a lot of things we can do that you don't need to have it to be scaled. So the first thing I wanted to do was to test the Bazant crush down, crush up pile driver theory. Okay, well, the first thing is we know that net forces are always equal and opposite. Okay, and a falling block impacting a stationary larger block will experience an equal and opposite force. In the case of the towers, the top part is warmer, it's weaker, and it's smaller than the lower, larger part. And the bottom part is much stronger than the upper part. And so since the force of the impact is the same on both the smaller block and the larger supporting block of similar material, then the smaller block should be crushed before the larger block. Now, again, his paper is saying that, no, the smaller block crushes the larger block all the way down. Well, again, that defies it just even on face value. So one of my very early experiments is I tried any material. I tried several different materials to take a smaller block of whether it's ice or weak mortar, and I just kept repeating it. Again, this is a very small, simple experiment to see if a self-supporting structure of similar material will the upper part demolish the lower part before the upper part is destroyed. And in all cases, I couldn't think of any material where the upper block destroyed the lower block all the way down, let alone crush itself back up. And that's exactly what this crush down, crush up theory is proposing. So it made no sense. And here's some concrete blocks. Again, I was trying all kinds of things.
Getting serious here.
Yeah, and this is just some of my early experiments just to see, basically, I'm pretty much proving the obvious here, but we have to do that to see what nature is telling us. That, again, not only does it defy Newton's third law, it defies experiment. Well, here is a falling pancake floors. Will that uniformly accelerate down? Here it comes down. Will it keep going? Will that mass keep going? No, it doesn't. It always slows down. It slows down. And those, I made those out of paper walls. I made them as weak as I possibly, paper walls with little matchsticks for the lower ones, or would just crush itself, but it always slows down.
That was a lot of work, John. This is incredible.
Yeah. Here is a pancake, if you will, another stack of floors. Well, of course,
it slows down.
It always decelerates, right? Well, then I took a falling solid steel block. This was a heavy steel block. And I made a very, very weak floor system that could support could support the steel block. Again, I was trying different types of materials and setups to see if that would continue to accelerate down. Now we have increasing masses there, but it still did not, it always decelerated. And here it is in, I think, slow motion. So here's the falling block. Now this is accelerating at the rate of gravity, 9.8 meters per second. Doesn't matter what the number is, but it's faster than what the Twin Towers were. Yay. So again, this is where we left off. Again, it always decelerates.
That one stopped altogether.
Yeah. And again, I tried to make it as weak as I could. I was trying to give the benefit of the doubt. Now, as you well know in all your presentation, we heard a lot of sounds of booms. Okay, there was ample, and you've played this many times, ample evidence of booms.
Floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
Well, NIST, because they stopped before the collapse even started, they never explained where the booms came from. So the other media tried to explain it away. One of them was, again, this crush down, crush up theory paper by Professor Bazant and others. Frank Greening's part of them. They're claiming that the booms must have been from sonic booms. They're saying there were sonic booms because as it approached the ground, the fluctuations in the speed must have, it was going almost 500 miles an hour. And this explains the loud booms, even though I think the speed of sound is 740 miles an hour. You have to exceed that. But that was their claim, that it must have been sonic booms.
I had never heard that one, John.
Yeah, that's in their paper. So they say the air ejected from the building by gravitational collapse must have attained near the ground the speed of almost 500 miles an hour. Well, it doesn't when you use the 2/3 free fall. This explains the fluctuations from 500 to 740. This explains the loud booms and widespreading pulverized concrete and fragments. In spite of these uncertainties, it is clear, they say, that the exit airspeed is on the order of 500 miles an hour, and that its fluctuations jumping up to 740. This must, of course, create sonic booms, which are easily mistaken for explosions. Now, others also tried to explain, since NIST never explained where those sounds of explosions came from, and as you know, there is a huge volume of evidence of explosions. The other theory that came up was it was actually a chemical reaction, and that's jumping back to this aluminum sprinkler theory. They say after about an hour, the molten aluminum ran down through the tower where the smelt came in contact with the water from the sprinkler system and then exploded, causing the sounds of explosions and bringing the towers down. So it was the molten aluminum from the plane and then being hit by the water from the sprinkler system. And that's all the explosions that the firemen and everybody else heard. That's their story.
I think these people have too much time on their hands and are just dreaming up any possible theory to try to put people's minds to rest about all of these conspiracy theorists, the rest of us, who are trying to bring out the forensic evidence.
Exactly. I mean, they're grasping at straws, but they have to, because this is high treason and mass murder. So they must lie. They have no choice because they can't explain it. So they're forced to do it. I get that. I want to talk about the sequence of forces. Remember when before I said there was two fundamental motions observed? One was downward, obviously, and the other one was outward. Remember all that lateral ejections coming out. So the question is, a lot of us assume that the sequence of motions must have been down first and then out. Makes sense. Something's falling down and then blowing out. But what if that sequence is not correct? What if instead of being down first and then out, what if it was out and then down? Is that possible? Well, let's let nature tell us. Let's do some experiments. Well, I built a little firecracker test. This was my first one, and where I just show the concept. There's an outward force first, and then gravity follows coming down. Okay, so that was really just kind of the first crack at it, if you will, pardon the pun. I needed more explosives and I needed a tower. So again, this is not to mimic the tower itself. This is to mimic the motions of the tower. So what I did is I cut all these small, I don't think these are asbestos. These are some old roofing style shingles that we have here in Florida. And then I built these paper walls and I threaded in a fuse all the way down here and I put firecrackers inside of them. And I put the fuse about where the plane hit. And I tried to sequence it going both up and down, which is kind of a tricky thing to do with just ordinary firecrackers. So here's a kind of a rhetorical question. Instead of sonic booms being caused by breaking the speed of sound from the fall or aluminum and water, is it possible that explosives, and a firecracker is an explosive, obviously can they make booms?
Wow. And the whole thing goes down afterward.
Right. So we know obviously explosives, which everybody heard, that is a much more plausible explanation for the sounds that the people heard.
Well, it accounts for the out also.
Right. Exactly. And so now we're getting to the out part. Instead of the sequence being down first and then out, the smooth downward motions of that roof that everybody measured, if we reverse it and go out first and then down, we start to mimic the motions that we saw. Again, I did all the downward ones before with the impacts. They didn't work. They stopped going. But if we blow out first, then we have a nice smooth downward acceleration of that roof line. And again, my timing was very difficult with this because I don't have computer controlled explosions. But when they are going off, yeah, that will make that roof line accelerate smoothly and uniformly downward.
As we saw in the videos of the Twin Towers.
Right. So explosive sounds, white smoke, downward motion of the top and the lateral motion of the walls are all exhibited when we use small explosives. You have all the things that are exhibited, not precisely, but fundamentally the key elements are there when we use explosives. So nature is telling us that, yeah, if you put explosives in those floors and you have them timed right, you're going to have all the elements of what we observed. Let's compare the fall of the tower with the three different, with the several different experiments that I did. And let's see which motion makes the most sense as we compare the two. Here's that block drop, that slowed down. That slowed down. But this one keeps going down uniformly, just like the towers. So the point is that nature is saying that the force had to come out first and then down. There it is again. That makes the most sense as far as what nature is telling us. So again, based on experiments, the direction of the net force behind the motion was from the inside of the building, right? It wasn't from the outside, it wasn't any directed energy weapons. And the sequence of forces, which is independent of scale, had to be out first and then down. It couldn't have been down and out. Since both the pancake and the pile driver theories disagree with experiment, because they're saying they're down first and then out, well, they're wrong, again, just based on that one experiment.
Well, John, I have go back one slide. If we could discuss this in the first 3 seconds, both towers exhibited only first 2 seconds only down, not out yet. Do you have a comment on that?
I think if you look carefully, I think there was outward motion there. There was some outward puffs coming out at the same time that was coming down.
Okay, gotcha. Just not the big mushroom cloud.
No, not in the big mushroom cloud, but you'll see immediately when it'll start going down, you'll see puffs of black smoke coming out all around that thing. That's a motion of smoke or debris.
Gotcha.
Okay. I want to talk now about something that's not talked about very much, either on AE 9/11 or anybody else. I usually talk about the beginning of the collapse. I want to talk about the entire collapse, the time of the entire collapse, and what I call the Spire's single column. Again, this is this two-phase process that the progressive collapse, the crush down phase and the crush up phase with this pile driver concept where a smaller block drives down the larger block. And he's saying that there's only two phases here. Again, this is getting to the motion history. He says that the assumed motion for the entire collapse, he calls it the entire collapse, and he has a graph here. This is free fall. The blue line is nothing more than the height of the building in meters versus the time for both the north tower and the south tower. It doesn't matter. They're both about the same. And he says that the time for the total collapse, entire collapse, somewhere around 12.4 seconds, maybe a little bit more, say 15 seconds. And again, 15 seconds. Again, we're talking ballpark here, but somewhere between 12 to say 15 or 16 seconds for the entire collapse. And everybody seems to say that. Oh yeah, it took 12 to 15 seconds for the towers to come down. Well, did it? Let's observe the entire collapse of World Trade Center 1. Let's see what we're looking at. And let's identify the real collapse stages. Now, this usually freezes up on me. I'm just going to let this play. I'm saying there's 4 stages, not 2. Okay? The 4 stages are, the first is the visible top, where we can see the visible top. Stage 2 is what I call the lateral destruction, where everything blows outward, but you can no longer see the visible top. Stage 3 is what I call the standing core. And stage 4 is the falling core. Now let's watch this thing and see what really happens. So here's the visible top. Here it's starting to go down. After about the first 3 seconds, it's gone. Now we have the lateral destruction phase where it's going down. Okay, and then halfway through this lateral destruction stage, we're going to see some columns stick above. There they are sticking above. They're kind of fuzzy, but it's going to zoom in. Now all the floors are down, but what do we have standing? We have the standing core. There's those core columns. They haven't gone down. The collapse is not complete. Okay, that standing core finally falls straight down after about another 15 seconds. So if you time the total collapse, it's not 12 seconds, it's not 15 seconds. It's more like 32 seconds for that building to come down. Again, we can watch it one more time. Hopefully it doesn't freeze. And anybody can go online and do this and say, well, no, it's not 15 seconds. And again, we have 4 different collapse stages. Here's the lateral destruction. Here's that standing core peeking out from all that dust and powder there. There it is. There's that core. The whole tower is not down. Most of the tower is down, but not all the tower. And that stands for 15 seconds as a free structure. That's building 7 right in front of it, by the way. That thing stands tall, nothing's moving, and then down that falls too. The total elapsed time is around 30 to 32 seconds. That is the time for the entire Tower 1 to collapse, not 15 seconds. So if we compare what they had in the paper, they had a 2-phase. They had to crush down, crush up. And that's only in the theoretical world. Okay, that's only with mathematics and equations. He says there's 2 phases. I redrew the graphics of what we really looked at in the real world, and I'm saying first stage is about right. We have the visible roof, but then that visible roof disappears, and we have the lateral destruction stage. As that's going down, we see these core columns sticking up. Stage 3 is for 12 to 15 more seconds, and then stage 4 is this final core columns coming down. So this does not match observation. Once again, this theory, this crush down, crush up theory, it may work in mathematics and theory, but it doesn't work in the real world because it does not match observation. Now let's look at that motion history graph he had in there. He had a motion history graph. This was from his paper. Remember this? Where it shows the motion coming all the way down here in about 15 seconds. He's saying it's for the entire collapse. That's what it says in the paper. Well, again, that's in the theoretical world. In the real world, I redrew this graph. I'm saying the motion history, I'm saying it's about the same what he had in the beginning, or they had. It was a multiple author paper. This is the measurement of the top of the tower coming down. A lot of it continues down, but really the top of the tower freezes. Those central core columns, they continue in part of stage 2 and all along stage 3. They don't move at all. And then finally, after another 15 seconds, they start to roll off and drop straight down. So this is more representative for the entire collapse duration as far as the real world and what we just observed. This makes more sense than this.
That's true.
Now they also have, they want to compare their theoretical model. They want to compare it to the video record. And they say in there, this is a quote, figure 3, this is figure 3, these figures right here, compares the motions of the topmost rim corners of the north and south towers during the first few seconds as predicted by the model with obtained from a available video. The model is seen to agree with the video records quite well. I use an analysis of forecast models for hurricanes. We just went through Hurricane Ian last September, pretty good sized hurricane. All the forecast models agreed in the first few hours, but after that they varied wildly. Well, let's look at their model comparison. Look at his time. He's saying for the first 2 seconds, his analysis compared very nicely with the South Tower in the first 3 seconds for the North Tower. Well, we know that the towers took over 30 seconds to fall. So to compare and to claim that your model fits what happens in the real world based on only 1/10 of the actual event is not accurate.
Correct.
Let's look at the motion of these core columns. Let's zoom in on these core columns. Notice that these core columns are not bent and they're not buckled. Okay. So let's look at this motion here. Those things stood. Here's building 7 right in front of it. By the way, this is a huge structure. This is not a small structure. It's huge. Those columns aren't bent. Nothing's buckled or bent. This is actually a loop. Look at these cut columns right here. Look how they break off. They're cut. They're almost severed. Okay, well, the pancake theory couldn't have cut those. We don't know what cut that steel. The pile driver couldn't have cut those. They weren't dustified by any exotic weapons. I don't think a mini nuke cut those individual columns. And the aluminum from the plane is long gone, and so are the sprinklers, so that didn't do it. So the question is, what cut these columns that are all tipping like a tree? And they're cutting and they're falling away from the rest of these core columns. You see this loop right here? You see them falling? They're not bent, they're straight. Something cut those box column and tipped them over like a tree. The question is, what did it? And there's an awful lot of white smoke around it. So what cut the columns? Nothing, none of the theories explain this. And here's just some more, this is just a still picture. Here's this cut column, something cut here, and there's all this white smoke around here. The question is, what cut the core columns, making them fall like a tree? None of the theories explains that. Well, we do know that fire cannot melt steel. It can't cut steel unless it's in a acetylene torch, but a natural office fire can't do that. However, there's these things called shape charges that can cut steel. I've got this book called Demolition. It's right here. It's written just about a year or so before 9/11. And there's a quote in there that says, linear shape charges focus the energy of the charge into a line generating 3 million PSI of pressure. Such charges can be used to slice steel as thick as 10 inches. Well, those box columns, I don't think were 10 inches at that. Is it possible that their linear shape charges were placed here to make those things cut straight across there?
Yeah, just correction, John. The box columns were you said weren't 10 inches. They were 14-inch square steel tube columns, but they're hollow. So that's the distinguishing.
Correct. And I think they were 14 inches down at the bottom, but then they tapered all the way up to about a quarter inch at the top, correct?
Quarter-inch thick at the top
Quarter inch
and
thick. Yeah,
3 or
yeah,
4 inches
hollow.
thick at the bottom.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Here's just an aerial observation picture of ground zero with all these straight cut pieces of steel and also some segments here. Now, there were some curved sections out there, but there was an awful lot of straight sections that were cut. What would have cut that steel? Doesn't make sense that the pancake theory or the pile drive theory could actually physically cut steel. Now, this was blown outward from the tower, as you well know. This was blown out up to 600 feet in radius, 1,000 to 1,200 foot diameter. Dr. Woods wanted to know, where did the tower go? That was the name of her book. Well, if you want to know where the tower went, just look all around the tower and you'll see where the tower went. And that steel wasn't dustified. There's the tower.
You know what the proof of that steel not being dustified is? If you look at all the various analysis of the dust by, for instance, U.S. Geological Survey, R.J. Lee, etc., they find all kinds of things in that dust, including previously molten iron microspheres, but they find no steel, dustified steel. It's not there.
Right. And yeah, they're called iron microspheres and not called steel microspheres.
Yeah.
And the other thing, if you're a practical guy, again, I've got a piece of steel here I set up for my rifle range. You ever filed a piece of steel or take a grinder and grind some steel? It'll make very small dust after a lot of work. Take that dust and throw it up into the air. What's going to happen? Does it float away? No, it's denser and it falls down to the ground. So the steel wasn't dustified. We can see the steel here. Now, there was over 200 acres of concrete floor. Yeah, that was powdered. That could have been powdered, but the steel did not turn to dust. The steel was there. I want to look at the roof. This is what I call the roof versus the spire. And I want to look at a single column on that spire. By the way, this central area here is called the spire. So we hear me call the core columns or the spire. This is just a picture, a still picture. This happens to be in front of another building. It's not tied to this building. And this spire or this central core columns, which again stood for 15 seconds after the building came down, are very straight. And you can see all the connections from all the floors. The floor spacing, I'm sure you can correct me on this one, they were probably about 12 or 14 foot spacings out there.
12 feet.
12 foot spacings. Okay. So these are all the connections. And inside this area here ran the elevators. And there's capacity equations that tell you that the strength of a column is dependent upon how long the column is, called its effective length, and whether it's connected on both sides. Well, this column here, when it was built, had connections every 12 feet, right? Going up. And now it's just standing there. It's just slightly wavering, but notice it's not buckled. Now this column is much, much, much longer. Matter of fact, I estimate it's roughly maybe about 100 feet long if you compare these floors of this building over here. Now you have a long, thin column that's fixed at the bottom and free at the top. Well, I can tell you, when you have a long, free column like that, that's much longer, that the capacity, the downward load on that column is much less and not more than its original design strength, because it was designed to be connected all through here. So any downward force from a falling top block or a pancake floor had to be imposed less on this column and not more than its design strength, or we would have seen this thing buckled. And by the way, there's some other ones here too. So the force during the collapse process on this column to allow it to be straight like that and not buckled was less and not more. In other words, if you take a toothpick, okay, there I am holding a toothpick, and you try to drop a plate through the toothpick, well, obviously that toothpick cannot remain straight and the plate fall through it. Something's got to give. Either the toothpick's got to give, and in our case, the toothpick didn't give, or the plate's got to give in order to get down through that toothpick.
Well, in the South Tower, there were 35 or so plates all together.
Right.
So something happened to them to get through that toothpick, I think. Right.
So since the upper floors cannot fall through the standing spire core column, the roof trusses, this whole roof, these things are an acre in size, that whole roof and this hat truss, we talked about the hat truss earlier, and all the floors below it had to have been fragmented and or propelled laterally, that lateral motion, in order to pass through this standing spire without buckling, and it didn't buckle. So we know all the material above had to impose whatever force hit that was much less than the design there. It had to have been blown outward. And that explains why the first volume to be destroyed was the upper block. It also explains why we can't see that upper block after the first 2 or 3 seconds. It's gone. They were destroyed and blown outward before they ever got down to those lower inner core columns. And those lower inner core columns, that were around, I think, around the 60th floor roughly. So they had to have been destroyed or that spire would have buckled. I want to talk about what I call the decline and fall of the tower spire. I want to look at the spire itself when it fell. Again, these are the inner core columns, the last 15 seconds of the fall. First of all, again, this is a big structure. This spire was taller than the Washington Monument. And there's Building 7. It's taller than Building 7. Building 7's what, 47 floors, I think? Pretty big structure. Well, the spire is even taller. Okay? Good. So, again, we saw that the perimeter is all gone here. But how could nuclear bombs have been so selective to leave these standing? And, again, the steel was not being dustified. I'm saying that this steel was falling down through the smoke, through white smoke. And I'm saying there was probably multiple cuts bringing that spire down. Now, the directed energy folks are going to say, oh, no, that steel was dustified. I'm saying, no, that steel fell down through the smoke.
You can see it falling frame by frame, actually.
You can see it.
Good Lord. There are no words. You can see large pieces of the building falling. You can see the smoke rising. You can see a portion of the side of the building now just being covered on the right side as I look at it, covered in smoke.
So I thought about it. I wanted to do an experiment to demonstrate my hypothesis, if you will, that that was being segmented up and dropping through whatever was cutting it. So I did what I call a very simple experiment called the smoldering stick experiment. I started a fire in my backyard. We had a lot of debris left over from Hurricane Ann, so I just started burning it up. And then I grabbed an old fence post, an old cedar fence post. And I let it just get kind of toasted on the end there. Not the rest of it, just the end of it. There's a piece of barbed wire sticking in my old fence post there.
So it's hanging from a...
I'm holding it. I'm on a ladder here, and I'm holding it.
Oh, okay.
I'm on a ladder. I got my neighbor filming. I said, hey, come on over. I want to do a quick little experiment. I want to see what nature does here. So this is just smoldering. The whole stick is not on fire. I'm holding it with my hands. Just the tip was. And I just kind of threw it in that fire there for a while. Well, let's see what happens when that stick falls. Here it is falling down in slow motion. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to stop it. And what's happening? The stick falls, right? Obviously, the stick falls. Whoops. Let me come back here. I do this every time, it seems. Here comes the stick. The stick is falling, but the smoke can't fall. The smoke stays there, and it eclipses the stick.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I call this a falling stick. And so any object that's cut here, whether it's steel with cutter charges, those cutter charges can make the white smoke. And if there's multiple cutter charges, it'll make white smoke, but the smoke won't fall, the stick will fall. And that's what I believe is happening to the central core columns. The other motion I want to look at is there's actually 2 motions observed with that core column, with the spire falling. We have a nice video of this, and you can see a motion relative to the fixed building that's not moving in front. You're going to see first a sideways movement of this and then a downward. Okay, so sideways first and then down. I call it a diagonal decline. Okay, so the question is, what can cause what we're observing here? So here it is. Here's this fixed building in front. You see it moves sideways? See it go sideways?
Yeah, it's like it's floating.
It looks like it's almost floating. It's going diagonally down. Well, what can cause a huge structure like that, taller than a Washington Monument, relative to anything fixed, to go diagonally down? Well, I thought about that for a while too, and I said, well, maybe I'll put together another experiment.
Uh-oh.
Let's see here. So I used to be a woodcutter. I've cut lots and lots of trees. I've cut thousands of trees. I used to clear land and build roads. This is me back in 1980 in the middle of the woods. I know a little bit about dropping trees as well as you do and everybody else. And obviously, most of the time when you want to drop a tree, of course, you notch it. There's different kinds of notches, how you want to fell the tree, but you always leave a hinge and then you do your back cut, and that way you can direct the tree. Sometimes you put a loader or a chain on it if you want to fall it, but you want to make sure you leave that hinge or you're going to lose control if you're near a house or if it's a big tree. But if you're in the woods working, doing what we used to call weeding and thinning, and we're doing smaller trees and we don't care where that tree falls, we don't have time to make notches, or we don't need the time to make notches and be very careful about it. We just take our saw and we start cutting the back of it with no notch at all. And this is me. I just grabbed a saw, went out in my woods there, and I just wanted to show you the theory or the demonstration of a diagonally down motion. Here I am cutting. There it goes. It's going diagonally down. It's going sideways and down. Okay.
And that was like 3-4 times the width of the tree that it traveled, interestingly.
Yeah, it did. It slides down. You got to watch. You got to wear a hard hat. If this tree has limbs on it, sometimes it bonks you in the head. So you got to be careful. I know from experience, and I've cut a few trees in my life and got my head hit a few times. Maybe that's the way I am. I don't know. Maybe that's why I am. But again, I'm trying to mimic the motion. Now, sometimes, actually many times, when you're in the thick of the woods, this tree, once you cut it diagonally down, it'll get stuck because there's other trees around it up top. Yeah. And so what happens is the branch gets all fetched, if you will, in those other trees. So then you have to take your saw, and I do a back cut. Okay, and I'll slice backward at a 45, and it'll drop it down again, diagonally down. Well, imagine if I could do a back cut every 4 feet all at once. If I could do that, and I can't with a saw, but if I could, that tree would come straight down. So if we had shape charges all up and down that thing, it would make the diagonal down. But let's forget about trees. Let's look at what the professionals say. Let's see what the linear shape charge does.
The job of the shape charge is to cut steel H-beams.
The way we do this is by cutting the beam at an angle, which through a series of beams cut at the same angle will tend to make the building shift over and walk.
So he's saying that they do cut a series of them at an angle, very similar to what I'm doing with my tree. And here's just some diagrams you can get online. And he's saying that they cut them at an angle and they make the whole structure walk. Well, let's take a look at this. What do you think this was caused by when you observe this? Do you think it was a floor by floor pancake collapse? Was it a pile driver crush down, crush up phenomenon? No, for either of those. The floors are long gone. Is it being dustified by directed energy weapons? No, we can see it falling down. How about nuclear bombs? Again, why did that core column stay? If there was a nuclear bomb in the basement, why didn't it take out those core columns to begin with? And the sprinklers were long gone, and the airplane was long gone. So could shape charges cause this big structure to walk, and then subsequent shape charges all the way up that thing, cut that thing up, and make it fall straight down? Seems like that's possible to me. Again, it's diagonal and down.
You've convinced me.
And my computer hasn't crashed yet. I'm very thrilled with that.
Yeah.
Pretty good. All right, so what can we conclude with all this? Well, number one, the two-phase crush down, crush up scenario assumed in that pile driver model is wrong, because we know there's at least 4 stages. We observe 4 stages: the visible top, the lateral destruction, the standing core, and the falling core columns. There's 4, not 2. The assumed duration that everybody assumes, almost everybody, maybe that's why they don't want to look at this what actually happens on the event, but they're all assuming less than 15 seconds. Okay, in the papers they all say that. A lot of people say that, oh, all the floors came down, the whole tower came down in 15 seconds. It didn't. It took 30 seconds. Even NIST said, from video evidence, significant portions of the cores of both buildings, roughly 60 stories at WTC1 and 40 stories at WTC2, are known to have stood for 15 to 25 seconds after collapse initiation before they too began to collapse. So NIST knew it, but they never had to address it because that was after collapse initiation.
Well, what's incredible there is that NIST is using as their theoretical basis Besant's crush down, crush up theory, which is in direct contradiction to this very paragraph found in their own report.
Exactly. It's completely contradictory. So everything is contradictory on this thing. Everything's all muddled and confused, which is probably what they want us to be. Okay, the other thing that we can conclude is the top block of floors was not hidden in the dust, because that's what they're saying. Well, maybe after the first 2 seconds, that top block was just hidden in the dust. No, it wasn't hidden. It couldn't have been, because it couldn't have remained intact all the way down to the ground. It had to have been destroyed early because it could not have passed through the still standing intact core. The assumed crush down phase has to be wrong because it couldn't have got through those core columns. Well, since there's no crush down phase, obviously there couldn't have been any crush up phase because that block never made it down to the ground. And since there was no crush down phase, the velocities could not have approached Mach 1, causing any sonic booms. Okay, that's ridiculous. Something else made those explosive sounds that were heard. And by the way, those explosive sounds were heard before the building came down, as well as during the building, not once it was all the way down to the ground. Yep. What else can we conclude? Any downward force of that falling top must have been less and not more than the design capacity of the standing core columns, or we would have seen them buckled and bent. We did not see them buckled and bent, so the force had to be less, not more. So some unnatural forces must have been involved to fragment or blow out the upper top part laterally, allowing the core columns to still stand. Something moved it out of the way or broke it up in such small particles.
Now you'll get to this in part 2 of this series, John, when you talk about temperatures. But with all due respect, we do have a lot of columns that look like noodles. But you want to discuss that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, some columns were heated and bent. That's what I said. In that ground zero, there was a lot of straight ones, but there was also a lot of curved ones. And I get on those in my second webinar where I talk about all those other elements, iron microspheres, nanothermite, things like that. I'm trying to just deal with the motion now. But yes, there was both straight columns and there was a lot of heated curved columns. So some unnatural force had to have fragmented or blown out the top part laterally, allowing those core columns to still stand, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have stood. And some unnatural force also must have cut those straight core columns to fall like trees. Remember, before that spire came down, we saw those tipping over away from the center, a lot of them. Well, something cut that steel. It wasn't a pancake and it wasn't a pile driver. And some unnatural force, again, must have been applied to the remaining core columns after those ones that tipped over like a tree, causing the decline and the fall down through its path of most resistance, normally, during the final falling core phase. Something brought that thing down. None of that was addressed. What else can we conclude? Well, not only is the crush down, crush up theory wrong because it doesn't match experiment, nor does it follow Newton's laws, the pancake theory has to be wrong. In fact, all gravitational collapse theories are wrong. Whatever theory you come up with, if it's just gravity alone, it's got to be wrong. Or the columns that we observed in those standing spire would have buckled. Something would have bent. It didn't. It stood straight. Now, there's many other reasons why all gravity collapse theories are wrong. The missing jolt, all kinds of other reasons. But this is just a direct observation. It doesn't take any equations or any math to see it, that it has to be wrong. The spire, that standing spire, is the Achilles heel of all gravitational collapse theories, or it would have buckled and bent, and it didn't. It's also the Achilles heel for the DEW, the mini nuke, and the aluminum sprinkler theories too, because again, that aluminum was long gone by the time we saw this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's going to be some common rebuttals when I use this scientific method. I'm trying to show what nature does. The first one would be, well, this was done in America, so this can't be true because this is America, and America would never do this. So where and when the buildings fell, that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if we did it in Russia, Spain, or America. We're studying the motions of a building. The other thing that the media will do is they will ignore, they'll deny, they'll distract, or they'll lie about the key evidence. They will not talk about the key evidence. They won't talk about any of this stuff that I'm talking about. They'll talk about some other nonsense, but not the key evidence. They will also make incorrect assumptions, statements such as, well, they must have done this, or they'll jump to conclusions. You saw in that paper where many times, even in the mathematical paper, they say, well, it must have been from the sonic booms. Well, no, it doesn't necessarily must have been that. Or they'll just jump to a conclusion. Or they'll refuse to release data for their particular model or theory. We're well aware that they won't release the input data from Building 7, right? They won't even release it. And of course, there is no data for the Twin Towers because they never told us what happened. Or they'll attack the presenter, okay? Rather than the evidence or the theory, rather than talk about the theory, they'll attack the presenter. So whether it's you, Richard, you've been attacked quite a bit, or me, or anybody out there, well, what do? You smear the presenter. You call you all kinds of names. But the thing they don't want to do is they don't want to address the hard evidence that you show them. Or they'll tie you to something else. They'll tie you to something else that you may or may not believe in. Okay, you may believe something else that's off topic, and that's your right. But when we're focusing on the scientific method and what happened during that duration, it doesn't matter what your beliefs are somewhere else. What matters is what you're saying relevant to the topic at hand? But they'll try to smear you with that idea too. Or they'll try to use improbabilities to trump impossibilities. What do I mean by that? They'll come up and they'll say, well, how many people would it take to rig the towers? That's ridiculous. They could have never done it. Or somebody would have talked, so therefore you must be wrong. Well, just because you think something is improbable does not mean it's impossible. And what I'm showing you are impossibilities, and we'll get in more with temperature later on a separate webinar, but I'm talking about impossibilities, and all your improbabilities, which you think, how many people would it take to rig, whether they brought it in on pallets or whatever, those are simply improbabilities. They can't trump our impossibilities, sorry. Or they'll say, rather than try to simplify something, I try to simplify things down so the average person can see what's happening. Normally what they'll do when they're trying to cover something up is they'll make it more complicated. They'll do just the opposite. They'll complicate the issue with a Gordian knot of all kinds of complex equations that we can't understand. And it looks very impressive, but as Richard Feynman said, he said, I don't care who you are or what your equations are. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And they'll do this in most cases, they will refuse to support the theory with real world experiments. They never do, because nature is going to prove them wrong. Because experiment is the sword that'll cut right through the Gordian knot. Hopefully you know what the Gordian knot is. But the Gordian knot of confusing theories and all these complex equations, show me with experiment. Now Tesla knew the game. He even back in his day, he knew how people tried to confuse things. And he commented on using only mathematics rather than real world experiments. He said, today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. The other thing they'll do is they'll smear whatever you're trying to, whether you're on YouTube or whatever, they'll either ban you from YouTube, they'll shadow ban you, I'm shadow banned, or they'll put up a warning sign under whatever you're trying to show them. Okay, they're trying to distract the viewer away from what you're trying to show them. Okay, and so they'll put I call it a blue band. I call it a blue warning band. Well, they'll say, oh, go look at the Encyclopedia Britannica rather than this video, as if the analysis of a falling building is somehow dependent upon the political context. The falling building doesn't care about the political context, doesn't care about your religion, doesn't care about any of that. But I always encourage you. I say, you know what? Go visit the Encyclopedia Britannica. Do what they're asking you to do. Watch my video and go over there and watch any other mainstream video on this thing and see if they can address the key evidence that's outlined here using the scientific method. They don't even address it, and they can't address it. And since they can't address the key evidence, they'll just declare a victory where really none exists. They'll make statements. They'll just make statements like, oh, it's all been debunked. Well, it hasn't been debunked. The only thing that's been debunked are the theories that cannot be supported by experiment: the pile driver, the dew, the pancake theory, the directed energy weapons, the no plane hit the towers, the aluminum sprinkler theories, and what they'll do is they have straw men. Well, they'll have some ridiculous theory that they'll debunk that, yes, but they don't do the key evidence that you point out, Richard, and so many others in this movement here. They can't do it. So again, do the theories address the motions observed? Not temperatures, just motions. The antenna's first fall, the first volume destroyed, the smooth downward acceleration we observed, the sequence of forces, the entire collapse time frame, the decline of the spire, the final fall of the spire, and the fall of those straight core columns. The pancake can't do it. The crush down, crush up, directed energy weapons can't do it. Mini nukes and aluminum sprinkler theory, they cannot address any of those. And any one of those would discard their theory. They can't do any of them. Only the explosive demolition theory, which was the very first theory we all observed on TV and we were told over and over again, only that explains all of the motions observed. Well, for any of the viewers out there, what theory do you think caused the collapse of the Twin Towers? Okay, well, whatever it is, don't tell us, show us. Show us by observation and experiment using the scientific method. Otherwise, it's just another pseudoscience theory like all those other ones that people put out there to support their beliefs. But remember, one more thing that Richard Feynman said was the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. I was fooled for 6 years. Okay?
Me too.
It's easy to be fooled. So any collapse theory that people want to put out there, they have to address the motions observed. They have to, and also have to do it in the right sequence. They have to show the upper core columns cut first, allowing the antenna to drop. That was about the first quarter of a second. They need to show the upper top destroyed, falling with no observable impacts or jolts. They need to show the floor and perimeter walls propelled laterally first, followed by the tower's corner destruction. They need to show the inner core columns or the spire that has to remain standing after everything else is down for another 15 seconds. And then they have to explain the final fall, the decline and fall of those inner core columns or the spire. And they have to explain it so the whole thing lasts about 30 seconds, not 15 like we were led to believe. Only the explosive demolition theory can explain all of the motions observed. That's the only thing that makes sense. Now, the good news is you don't need to be an engineer. You don't need to be a Richard Gage architect to see this. You don't have to do that. You don't even have to be very good at math or science. You don't need all those equations. You don't need to know about Newton. All you need to do is anybody who's practical and actually looks at the evidence, okay? They can see what happened to those towers. It was obvious. It was obvious the very first day it happened. They told us what happened. This is from news reporters. They're not architects or engineers or math physics wizards.
This is.
Oh my goodness.
There you see the building imploding. Do you see what's happening?
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
what would cause that? I don't know.
Well, you have, I mean, certainly the structure had been weakened by the impact, but you have to wonder if there was something else there, but we just don't know.
Yeah, we don't know, but it looks like.
And at this point, I can't imagine we're getting any word anytime soon.
I don't think, I think we're safe. Here at the Come on Safe Ground Bill, I don't think this was clearly the way the structure is collapsing. This was the result of something that was planned. This is not, it's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know. But clearly this is what they wanted to accomplish.
These are newspaper reporters. They see it. It's obvious. And there was another one from another station.
Anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
So they knew it. They could see it. Carl Sagan, he said, one of the saddest lessons of history is this. If we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. Boy, was he right. Now, he was gone before, I think, 9/11 happened, but he sees it. Bamboozles are all through history where you're convinced of something that just isn't so. Now, if you want additional resources and information for any of the newbies out there, AE911truth.org. Richard Gage started that organization. And of course, RichardGage911.org. He's got a lot of my videos and a lot of other excellent videos out there. If you want to see the direct source for my videos, again, I'm kind of shadow banned. I'm hard to find. You have to type in this exactly, Physics and Reason. And you can see all of the motion experiments that I've done over the years. Also, my work is on what's called 911speakout.org. That's David Chandler's website. Other good resources are out there. By the way, there's a lot of misleading resources, but other good resources. One that I particularly like is Jim Hoffman, who was one of the early pioneers. He has a great site, in my opinion, with a lot of evidence on it. 911research.com, and there's a lot more out there. There's some that I wouldn't recommend, but these are all ones that I would highly recommend. And if you're kind of interested in wondering, gee, maybe it was explosives that brought those down, how were they placed and where were they put and what happened? Well, one of the early pioneers that I haven't heard from in years is an engineer. I believe he's from Scotland by the name of Gordon Ross. Gordon, if you type this in exactly, you'll find his presentation that he did in the YMCA in 2007, before I was even aware of any of this thing. Like I say, I was clueless at the time. I was bamboozled. So Gordon Ross' investigation of the World Trade Center collapse, I highly recommend that. He outlines a pretty good theory as far as where the explosives were placed. And this is even before the nanothermite came out. So all I can say to any of the audience out there is don't be bamboozled by, just because it's the media and the authority. Bamboozles happen all through history, and I suspect they're still happening today. Don't be bamboozled. The other thing is that I don't know what's going to be done here, but nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something, even if it's some small part. Maybe share this video, share some of Richard Gage's work and a lot of the other greats that are out there doing this work. It's not right. Now, whether anything will be done or not, I don't know. But I think the more you know, the more you'll realize how the bamboozle is ongoing with this and maybe some other topics out there. So,
John, that was absolutely incredible. I was blown away by the level of experiments, the amount of time and effort and care you put into them. I can't even imagine how many hundreds and hundreds of hours you've put into this, and you've made it so clear. Like we said, a 2-year-old can figure this out after you explain it in this way, after you show experiments, after you show what can't do these things. It's as clear as can be. And yet I know there's some questions that our wonderful listeners and viewers have for us. And so to help us with that, let's bring about Ms. Gail Gage. Hello, Gail.
Yes. Hello. So don't be bamboozled, you guys.
No, do not be bamboozled.
And I love what you said, John, that one person can't do everything, but everybody can do something. That's sort of paraphrasing, but I love that because, such a great example of you doing a lot, and those, we're making huge efforts to do a lot. And those of you who aren't able to actually, be able to see that you're doing a lot, if you're supporting those who are and just encouraging them, and like John said, get the news out there, get what you've learned out to everybody in your world, your friends, family, coworkers, social media. We can all do something.
Absolutely.
Yes. So the first
yeah, you have a question.
You ready for
Good.
questions? Yes. This is from Ray, and I'll put it up on the banner. John talked about the first day news reportings that people mentioned explosives were used in New York. What do you know about the use of explosives in the attacks? How explosive were the attacks?
I think he's referring here to how explosive were the collapses, leaving aside the airplane, which you did mention, John. You had moved the building 20 inches. That's direct evidence of a lot of mass, which could be calculated at that floor hitting the towers. Probably equates to, given the flexibility of the building, that 20-inch movement laterally.
Yeah, and that movement was measured. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I clearly understand the question. Obviously, when the plane hit, there was an explosion of jet fuel. We all saw that blowing out of the building, and that was consumed pretty quickly. And again, people mention explosives. I mean, you saw those firemen floor by floor, bang, 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 coming down. There was an extensive amount of eyewitnesses with explosives. So what do I know about the use of explosives in the attacks? That's what the question says. Explosives, just based on motions alone, let alone the temperature elements of it with the iron microspheres and nanothermites, that wasn't germane to tonight, but just based on the motions alone and what I know about linear shape charges, it sure seems to me that, yeah, that building had to have been rigged somehow, some way with explosives to create the observed motions we saw, because no gravity collapse can mimic the motions that we saw. So
Yes. Awesome. Thank you. And we have another question. John did experiments with thermite in his backyard. Those experiments did generate a lot of heat, but no blast pressure. Have you ever tried using nanothermite in combination with jet fuel?
yeah, this will be on my second webinar on temperature, and I go through all my experiments with thermate and thermite. So, and I do show that generates heat, but it also cuts steel, and that's in my part 2 on temperature, where indeed I can cut steel with less than 2 pounds of thermate. I could slice through steel. So I know it will work, and I also know it melts steel. Obviously, we can put railroad tracks together. Specifically for the question, have you ever tried using nanothermite in combination with jet fuel? No, I haven't. I've never made nanothermite. Kevin Ryan made a small amount of it. I have never tried to use nanothermite in combination with jet fuel. I have no clue what it'll do, but I know nanothermite will do some damage.
Let's agree that jet fuel is simply a little more refined kerosene. There's nothing particularly explosive about it or heat producing, at least as it burns in open air. The manufacturer of one of the jet fuels says that it burns only 600 degrees Fahrenheit in open air.
Interesting. So Jon B says, any idea the explosive force of nanothermite versus standard TNT? This might be important to know.
I know a little bit about it, and again, I touch on some of this in my second webinar, not on the motion webinar. But yes, the explosive force of nanothermite is highly explosive. I think it's probably pound for pound more than conventional explosives. Kevin Ryan knows quite a bit about this. Professor Jones does, and maybe Richard does too. I don't know, but I think nanothermite is actually more than conventional TNT, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yeah, well, this is one of the confusing issues for all 8 of the scientists who worked on the active thermitic materials paper that was published in 2009 in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. And their concluding statement was that this was a pyrotechnic or explosive. So they don't even try to suggest how powerful it might be, at least in 2009. And there's been some more clarification by Niels Harrit on this since. You can look up that in a speech he gave about 2 years ago in Switzerland at a conference put on or sponsored by Barbara Honegger and others.
All right, next question is from Ken. The ghost effect of the column that falls down on itself, like your body melted straight down, hides the spire a bit. So what is that smoke that stays in the air shaped like the column? And you did a great job of showing that in the video you showed us.
Yeah, it's my opinion that though that spire came down with a series of cutter charges of some types. This is my opinion, and the reason I have that opinion is that the motion you could get to come straight down. I know again from cutting a simple tree, but I know if you cut all those almost sequence the same, that would drop something straight down, which is similar to a controlled demolition. Okay, when you have a whole bunch of series of explosions well timed, it brings a building straight down. Well, I think that was the last phase of the demolition of the Twin Towers. That was the final phase. In the smoke, was white smoke was indicative of the material used to cut those columns, whether it was nanothermite, whether it was thermite, or whether it was just conventional explosives. My firecrackers gave off white smoke. So the smoke, in my opinion, the smoke and the dust that brought that thing down was nothing more than the cuts at each one of them, and that was falling down through the smoke, just like my cedar post was falling down through the smoke. Only with my cedar post, it was only smoky at the bottom. Imagine it was smoky all the way up. Then falling through the smoke would be exactly what you would see. So that's why I did that experiment. So I think the smoke is residue from the explosives that took that core column down. That's my opinion.
Gotcha. Thank you. Next question. Garganite asks, what is the best evidence for who physically placed the explosives and when they did so?
Yeah, as far as who did it and exactly when, again, Richard probably knows more about this than I do. But there was a, and this was talked about quite a bit. There was a main elevator upgrade from Ace Elevator, like I don't know, 9 months or so beforehand. There was a transfer in ownership. There was probably I don't know, because I don't know about the best evidence for who physically placed the explosives and when they did it. The when would be obviously sometime before the tower came down. It's a pretty obvious statement. Probably in the 9 months before. They probably had time, 9 months, to prep this thing to get this thing down. There's a lot of evidence on that. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence and even testimonial evidence of people hearing things moving around on the floors and people bringing pallets up and down elevators or whatever. But as far as who, obviously, the who is pretty high up there because it's being well covered up. The who probably is probably part of the U.S. government. This is all speculation, by the way, and probably somebody who is helping to control or shape the narrative as part of the reason why we don't know who did it and why we don't really know what happened to those towers.
And the censorship certainly helps from the mainstream media to censor all theories and evidence that have been brought forth in the last 20 years by the 9/11 Truth Movement.
Right.
Yep. Another question. John, you are convinced explosives were used in New York on 9/11. What do you think about the use of explosives at the Pentagon and Shanksville, talking about sonic booms and ejections outward?
Yeah, I don't know. Shanksville, I guess that's where the plane went down. I mean, I've heard things that the plane was spread out, and I'm drifting outside of what I talked about tonight. So this is just Jon Cole and making comments here. But I mean, there's people that were talking about maybe the plane in Shanksville was shot down. I don't know. I don't know for sure because I haven't studied that. My focus has really been on the Twin Towers. I have studied the Pentagon quite a bit. I've had varying opinions on that. My earlier opinions are not matching my current opinions. Is it possible that explosives were used in addition to the plane hitting the Pentagon? And yes, I'm one of those guys who originally didn't think a plane hit the Pentagon, and now I do based on the evidence after a couple of years of study. Were explosives used in the Pentagon in Shanksville? I don't know. I'm not sure. Again, this is more, I know more about the Twin Towers, so I really can't help you with that.
All right. Ray's got another question. Do you know that liquid fuel and nanothermite are used in thermobaric weapons? Do you know that a person was recorded by air traffic control that said, "We have a bomb on board"?
I'm vaguely familiar with thermobaric weapons. So no, I don't know a lot about it. So the answer is no, I don't.
Yeah, and I didn't know that nanothermite were included with liquid fuel. Something sounds off about that, but I don't know.
I don't either.
All right. Well, that is it for the questions.
All right.
Goodness gracious. John, you have been a hero today, coming back again and again and giving us the straight scoop right from experiment, the arbiter of competing hypothesis. You're coming back. Tell us what in part 2 next month when we have you back, what will we be learning?
Well, my second portion is just on temperatures, extreme temperatures found there. And I will be conducting experiments there. First of all, I'll be outlining what the evidence is, and we touched on some of it tonight with the iron microspheres. And you, Richard, are well aware of all the extreme temperatures out there. And I'm going to be outlining what that evidence is, and then conducting experiments that either prove or disprove what we were told. I did one called eutectic steel. I'm going to explain what that is, with gypsum around a steel I-beam, and whether that will cause the intergranular melting or the sulfur. And then I do quite a bit on, it was discussed tonight about thermate and thermite. I do quite a bit of experiments on that to show that what the mainstream media showed, they could not melt steel with thermate or thermite. The BBC couldn't do it. National Geographic couldn't do it, but I could do it with much less. And I'm going to demonstrate what they show, what we were told, versus what nature is telling us with experiments. So that's all about temperature in that one there.
Awesome.
Jon, you're incredible. You come back
Yes.
again, Gail.
That was a great presentation. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jon. I love how you present it in such a way that anybody can understand what you're saying, and there's not any guesswork that has to happen. And I don't have to know a lot of technical or scientific facts to understand it. So thank
We don't have
you.
to go back to school.
No.
Like you said, Jon, a 2-year-old can understand this. I
Definitely
love
a
it.
5-year-old can see it. So
Thank
So
you so
thank you.
very much, folks. Thanks for listening to Richard Gage 9/11. We're out with this.